Thank you, Adrian. It's great to be back here at the Clayman Institute, and I'm especially happy to be here to discuss Susan's powerful new book, Are You Two Sisters? The Journey of a Lesbian Couple. I'll start by saying that I've been familiar with and influenced by Susan Krieger's work for a long time, even before I began my PhD program here at Stanford. And I'm going to come back to this first connection with Susan here in just a moment. But first, just to say a bit about Susan as a sociologist. Susan Krieger is a sociologist who's conducted path-breaking work on the sociology of the self using autoethnographic methods. She has written 8 books, which Adrian just described, many of which take up the topic of how we develop a sense of ourself, the idea of who we are as a person, someone that is separate from others, but at the same time is developed through our interactions with others. And in particular, Susan illuminates how our communities, the places we occupy, and in this new book, our intimate relationships serve as mirrors that reflect back on us who we are and at the same time who we're not. As is very clear in Susan's work to me, our sense of self, which is seen as something authentic and really personally driven, is somewhat ironically a social construction. So I first encountered Susan's work about 1993, so a long time ago, before I started grad school. I was taking a class on ethnography, and our class project was to conduct an ethnography of a group that we were a member of. The idea of this project made me uncomfortable. It would be awkward, I thought, to be hanging out with a group of people I knew and studying them. About the same time in 1993, my partner Ellie, who's here on the event today, had just purchased our first computer modem and had subscribed to a computer bulletin board service called Prodigy. This was before there was a free internet. I was somewhat annoyed with her at the time because I didn't think we had the money to be buying a modem and signing up for this bulletin board. Perhaps as a way of convincing me that the modem was a good and necessary purchase, she told me she had found a solution to my class dilemma project. There was a group on Prodigy, she explained, called the Lesbian Cafe. Prodigy members who joined this group entered this virtual space pretending to be in a bar. So they would introduce themselves to a bartender, pretend to order a drink and dance and the like, only using the standard keyboard characters that were available at the time. So I ended up doing this project, and I wrote a paper that I ended up publishing. I was brand new to sociological research, and my paper had only 15 citations. I mean, that's just unheard of. But by far the most foundational citation was a paper Susan Krieger had published in Science in 1982 called Lesbian Identity and Community. From the title, I suspect you can see why this paper was so foundational for my project. It was only after I published the paper that I found and read Susan's 1983 book, The Mirror Dance, Identity in a Women's Community, which was a study of a rural lesbian community. I was captivated by this book, both as a sociologist and as a then young lesbian woman. I'm still a lesbian woman, I'm just not young anymore. I love the metaphor of the mirror in this book, how communities reflect back on us who we are, and also the boundaries that separate us from the community. In Are You Two Sisters, the newest book, Susan holds up a different mirror, turning from the lesbian community to the closest, most intimate mirror, that of a lifetime partner, taking us on her journey with her lesbian partner called Hannah in this book. Perhaps more than any of her other books, Are You Two Sisters probes deeply into the tension between maintaining a sense of self while also being deeply connected to another human. I loved reading this book. It's engaging, it's beautifully written, and it's thought-provoking. It also turns the mirror back on the reader itself, leading us to reflect on our own intimate journeys, asking who we are and how we are both separate from and at the same time deeply connected to the person with whom we travel in life. So I'll just close by saying, Susan, I am deeply honored that you invited me to be a part of this event with you, and I'm really looking forward to our time together. To the audience, a quick sense of what we're going to do here. Susan's going to come on now and present a short presentation of her book. I'm then going to read an excerpt that she selected and she'll comment on it. I'll read a second excerpt, she'll comment on that. Then she and I will engage in a short fireside chat discussion with each other. Then I'll read a final excerpt. Susan will briefly comment, and then Allison Crossley, sociologist and executive director of the Clayman Institute, will present a few questions as time permits. So Susan, please welcome to the screen.
That was a very nice introduction, Shelley. I'm very, very grateful.
Thank you.
Something has occurred with our video. I think we're on now.
Yes.
Thank you. So thank you for that beautiful introduction. I'm Susan Krieger. I'm a little bit nervous, so I think I will say thank you also to all of those of you in attendance, some of whom I know, some of whom I don't. I'm very grateful to you for your support and your interest. I'm going to talk with you today about my latest book, Are You Two Sisters? The Journey of a Lesbian Couple. And I'd like to begin by saying this is an unusual ethnography in that I use the techniques of a novelist combined with those of a sociologist. And I also speak in a very intimate, personal voice. In Are You Two Sisters, I trace the life of a lesbian couple over a 40-year period, beginning in the 1980s with a meeting on a university campus and through the several decades that follow as the two women become increasingly intimate with each other and share adventures in the larger world. I focus particularly in Are You Sisters on the self-other dilemmas that the two face, both in relation to each other and in relation to the outside world. And especially in this book, I desire, and as I wrote, I was very focused on taking the reader along with me and along with us. I wanted the reader to feel right there with my partner, Hannah, and me in our travels. So I would include pieces of conversation between us, describe the scenes and the places where we went. I wanted the reader to come with us and to look at some of these dilemmas of differentiation of self from the other, myself in relation to partner and the two of us in relation to the outside world, and my reflections on them. And I wanted the reader to come to some of her own conclusions and interpretations. So having the reader with me has been very important for quite a few years as I wrote this book. I should tell you a bit at the start about the title, Are You Two Sisters? This emerged from an experience several years ago when my partner Hannah and I were traveling in the Southwest, and we had just had lunch in a fairly remote desert bar near the border of New Mexico, Arizona, and Mexico. Hannah was paying for our lunch at the counter, and I was going to step out toward our car. I followed my guide dog through the dark interior of the bar. As I did so, a man called after me, Are you two sisters? In a challenging tone. He then held the door open for me as I stepped out of the bar, and I didn't answer him, and I tried to quickly make my way across the dusty parking lot toward our car. Well, he followed me and he called again, Are you two sisters? I went even faster, got in the car, slammed the door, and hoped he didn't open it. He didn't, he went back into the bar. But his question did unnerve me a bit. When Hannah came out to the car, I told her what the man had said. What did you tell him? She asked me. I didn't say. I told her. And I felt immediately ashamed and like a coward, because this was 2017, surely a time when lesbianism was more accepted. But I had felt so self-protective. I just ran. I didn't want to answer the question. Now, I had been at that time already working on my ethnography about dynamics of self and other in a lesbian couple. And this experience made me think particularly about our relationship with the outside world, about that boundary between self and other. And it called my attention particularly to the sense of privacy and vulnerability and self-protectiveness I had as a lesbian when faced with that query in the outside. As we drove along on our travels that day, the man's question did haunt me, both, why did he ask? Why did he need to know? And even more importantly, why was it so hard for me to answer him? My goal in Are You Two Sisters? The Journey of a Lesbian Couple is somewhat to provide some answers, especially to that last question. Why the need for self-protectiveness? Now, I'll stop there for now. What I'd like to do as a way of introducing you to the unusual style of the text that uses the interior voice, but brings the reader along, and that speaks from personal experience, but at the same time wishes to address broader issues. To give you a sense of that, I've asked that Shelley would read from the very beginning of the book, the first chapter called Our Marriage Day. And I think I'll be glad to turn it over to Shelley now for the reading.
Thank you, Susan. So I'm going to be reading to you. I'm not a professional reader, but I'm going to do my best here. Okay, so here we go. I had rolled over in bed earlier that morning and given Hannah a kiss, as I do every morning before getting up. But this day was going to be different. Happy Marriage Day, Hannah said from out of her sleep, returning my kiss softly, lingering with it more than usual. Happy Marriage Day, I said, feeling an awkwardness about how the day would go, the high expectations, fearing what might be different after the big event. What would it do to us, I wondered? We'd been okay as a couple so far. We had come a long way. We'd learned how to get on lovingly with each other, sometimes with pain and effort, but we were doing all right. Now, after 32 years together, we were going to change things. Why mess with it, I thought. I had visions of couples who built a house so they could live happily ever after, and then when it's done, they would break up. I did not want that to happen to Hannah and me. Do you think we'll be okay? I asked my love as she lay beside me in the warm bed. Of course, don't worry. It's just City Hall. I'm going back to sleep, she said. Leaving her comfortably under the covers and stepping out of the room to get dressed, I thought about the first time I had been married, back when I was in graduate school in the 1970s. The man I married would later choose to be gay, and I would choose lesbianism, but we didn't know that then. At the time, I think we did what was conventionally expected of us, fulfilling dreams for how we ought to be, for the next steps we should each take in life. I did not even then believe in the necessity of marriage. It seemed to me too full of expectations about how two people ought to behave together. It seemed to confer a higher status than that which would befall me as an individual unmarried woman. But only after we got married did the momentousness of it hit me. I looked down at my gold wedding band and suddenly thought, this should not be. I should not be getting extra privileges because I am now married. People should not be looking at me differently as a more desirable woman, perhaps because I'm married to a man, because someone wants me. But most of all, it was the extra rights and privileges that bothered me, the legal and financial advantages, the sense that it was viewed as better to be in a couple than alone. I thought that all the same advantages should be given to persons as individuals. The couple should not be the more valued unit. Thus, as I looked at the ring on my finger, although I liked it, a classic thin gold band like my mother had, I did not like what it stood for, even as I wore it proudly, basking in the social acceptance it offered. Joel and I were married in my parents' backyard. I wore a white dress with a short skirt and a lacy top with a high neck and purple shoes. Joel wore a boldly colored flower tie and a pinstripe blue suit. After we had set our bows beneath a chuppah under tall trees standing across from the rabbi, Joel smashed the traditional glass and the family and friends made sounds of approval, calling out Mazel Tov and clapping for us as we walked back towards the house while a string quartet played. We had stepped just out of earshot when Joel turned to me and said, "We can break up any time. This doesn't have to be forever." I felt relieved. Those were my sentiments exactly, knowing what often happened with couples. I then went back to mingling with the guest. It was going to be quite different now, I thought. No white dress or flowered tie, no man, no audience, no reception in the yard, thank goodness. But it was still a ceremony, a charade in some sense of the word, a performance that might have little relation to my inner reality. Hannah and I would have to go to City Hall. We would have to sign papers. I was not looking forward to that, though I was looking forward to going to the beach afterwards with our dogs. I deeply loved Hannah, and I wanted to keep being with her, but there was something about the romanticization surrounding marriage, the sentimentality, the sense of forever, as if a statement of vows could make that happen. There was something about the unconventionality of everything Hannah and I had experienced together. Not only were we lesbians, but I was me, not quite fitting in, not like everyone else, uncomfortable often in my own skin. Would marriage make me more comfortable, more secure? Would it make us happier? I wondered.
Thank you, Shelley. Really appreciate that reading. So that's the beginning of Are You Two Sisters? Our Marriage Day. The chapter subsequently takes the reader through this ceremony and our experience in City Hall, but I hope you get a feeling for there's a bit of dialogue and setting of scene, starts in the bedroom, ends up in City Hall, and the interior reflections that the author posits. So there we have the beginning of chapter 1. I'm going to turn now to another excerpt, and this comes from a chapter called Moving In. Now that first one, Our Marriage Day, That day occurred when we had already been together for 32 years, the two members of the couple. Moving in occurs just after we had been together for 3 years, when the two of us, the two members of the couple and our usual sisters, have moved in together. And it caused me to reflect back on our early experiences. And my sense was at that time that those first 3 years were very formative and very challenging. So the next excerpt, Shelley, if you wouldn't mind to read, is from Moving In.
I'm happy to. So here we go. We were sitting in my room down on the peninsula several months before moving in together. We can just keep living in separate houses, I remember Hannah said thoughtfully, looking off into the air, then out the window, imagining, I thought, an eternal going back and forth, an arrangement that would let her have her separateness, that would keep things as they were. I looked at her, saw her ability to adapt, to stay the same, her calmness about it. I'll move to the city, I said. Would you like that? Why did I say that? Why did I offer? I think it was because deep down, I felt that Hannah, as she told me, would not move to the area where I was living. She made clear that she did not want to move anywhere in the vicinity, not even up in the hills, where my fantasies from the past lay, fantasies from a time before I knew Hannah, when I had lived in those hills with my first serious lesbian lover and felt I had finally found happiness. That early relationship had not lasted, but my dreams and hopes remained. I wanted to find new dreams with Hannah. Maybe we could find something in the middle, Hannah offered as we talked, meaning I felt something closer to the city. We considered it, but I felt it was not really an option. In the middle of what? Between what and what? With nobody where they wanted to be? I thought it was just a fantasy that we could leave in the middle. I felt very clearly right then that Hannah could not move to where I wanted to be. She simply could not do it emotionally. But I could do it, even if I was afraid of it. This is something you can do and she can't, I told myself. She can't do it the other way around. She can't come to you that way. I also thought, it's been 3 years. It's about time. You can't go on living in separate houses forever. And the headaches, I told myself, my headaches will get better because I won't be going back and forth every weekend. I'll move to the city, I said. I do not think I said, I'll move now because you agreed to not have children. You made a concession, so will I. I'm not sure I felt it was an exchange, but I thought about it. At least it paved the way. I know I felt I could do it, so I would do it, where she could not. I agreed. I said, I'll move to the city. And forever after, I have never let Hannah forget that I hate the city, did not like living there, and I did it for her. I think it's been terrible of me to do that, to remind her of my sacrifice, of how miserable the city makes me feel very often, how depraved. But I think when I bring it up, it lets out steam, keeps the water from boiling over, releases the extra angst. Sometimes I tell myself, wishfully perhaps, that I'm telling Hannah that I love her each time, love her enough to have moved for her. But it's a backwards way of saying it. It seems to me a habit I'd better drop. But I keep holding on to it. It relieves a constraint. It announces me to myself. I'm not this kind of person. I'm not the kind of person who lives here. I live somewhere else. I am here for Hannah. I am here because Hannah could not move to be where I was. It's odd perhaps that the merging of the two of us has required such separation, such assertion of my individuality, of my reluctance to be here, to be who I seem to be, here in the city with Hannah. I am holding myself in reserve. I'm somewhere else. Maybe I'm always somewhere else in part, but where? Where is that somewhere else? Am I destined forever to be not quite at home, not quite where I want to be? I was missing my past, my old homes and loves. At the same time, I was attempting to share, to incorporate Hannah in my new dreams, hoping she would do the same with me. Moving in together, it was so significant for us. There was our life before and then this life afterward. Back then, there was a joke that when two lesbians met, one of them brought a U-Haul on their second date because there was no way to be together enough without moving in. Soon they moved apart. The U-Haul came out again and they split up. The caution was to not do that too quickly. I prided myself, and perhaps we both did, on the fact that it had taken us 3 years. Hannah and I moved in together 3 months after she received tenure, a year after we traveled together to the desert and I had shared that part of my past with her, 2 years after I had met Hannah's mother, and a year and a half after she met mine. It was time to start over, to start living like two people who belong together.
Thank you very much, Shelley. So from that passage, I chose that for today because I wanted to illustrate the central dilemma of differentiation or self from other, or of the challenge of dealing with similarities and differences within a lesbian couple. And it also is a passage that has some humor in it. I like when I was writing this ethnography to incorporate inner reflections that have humor. And so I really appreciate hearing them read aloud. So there, I think I will have a pause. So I've illustrated both the central focus on dilemmas of likeness and difference and differentiation of the self within the couple. Often there can be a sense of need to assert one's individuality in a relation with someone who has much similarity with one. And then in relation to the outside world, there is also this question of how to assert one's identity when it may be invisible in that world. I think I'd like to turn it over to you now, Shelley, and see what kinds of thoughts you may have or questions that might lead us.
Yes, I have lots of questions, but I'm going to start with a couple that just to get us going on kind of how you went about writing the book. And, Are You Two Sisters is a very personal ethnography, and it's very highly crafted. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you went about writing it, in particular, how you decided what to include in the book and what not to bring in.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think I had initially as my subject that I was interested further in this subject of lesbianism. I had dealt with it earlier in the Mirror Dance and in some subsequent books to some extent, but I wanted to return to it. And closest at hand was this couple relationship. I took a very early stab at it with a chapter in the book that is called Early Memories. And at first I challenged myself as to whether I had the nerve to write about something as intimate and seemingly minor on the scale of important things as my relationship with another woman, drawing on that first person experience. But as I went on, I decided to keep with it. And in my writing for each of the chapters developed one by one, I would pick a central focus on an experience of self-other relationship, either within the couple or outside, that I would try to recreate so that I could relive it and the reader could relive it and try to see what are some of these self-other dilemmas and challenges that occur. And it just got built story by story, chapter by chapter, in that manner. I revise a great deal when I write, so I worked on that meticulously in order to try to be accurate to the true events of the couple's life, but also to tell stories that might make the reader interested and then to raise questions of reflection. So I was very much the ethnographer in doing this. Even though I'm drawing from personal experience, I'm really marshaling it with an intent concentration, often on the internal dynamics within the couple, but at times between the couple and the outside.
Did the real life Hannah ever object to something you wanted to put in the book and tell you to take it out, or how did that go?
Oh yes, the selection, of course. Yes, I have been fortunate in that the real life Hannah was from the beginning very supportive of what I was doing. It's also true that we did have an understanding that if there was something in the long term in what I was depicting that she was sensitive about, she could tell me, and I would take it out if it really was needed, or I would try to explain why I thought it was important. So over the life of the writing of that study, we did have different discussions of that. And I think I always viewed it as a lot of fiction because, when you're creating something that draws from personal experience, you are, or at least I am, very aware of my own limitations. I remember something and I think I accurately remember it and I try to get it as accurate as possible, but my memory can be faulty. And in this case, I'm one person telling the story of two in a way, but I'm telling the story from the inside of me and it's often the outside of the other, using dialogue and all to represent Hannah. So I was in need of consulting with her at times, and I think we worked it out in our way, but most of all, I think she was supportive because there would be parts that she would never have told it that way or never even have talked about the subject. And but she was very supportive of my doing so. And I tried to be careful, both self-protective of us as a couple at the same time as revealing of us as a couple. And I think that took constant thought throughout about kind of how to do that. And then the litmus test would be, would it go by okay with Hannah? And she has been very generous about that.
Well, I can see how that would have been a tricky balance and a bit of challenge in and of itself. And I just wonder more generally if you could talk about some of the biggest challenges you faced in writing the book.
Oh, for my particular challenges,
Yeah.
writing the book, I think I'm a lot a writer. And the biggest importance for a writer is to have the reader keep reading. So my biggest challenge always in writing, I can write a rough draft that has the flow to something, but I have to revise it a great deal in order to feel that I'm really telling the reader what the reader needs to know about the scene or the emotion or getting it accurate. And I'm making my prose flow so that the reader have a way of writing that I don't want the reader to stop at the end of any paragraph. I try to keep a cadence so that you'll have to go on to the next paragraph in order to keep that rhythm. So I write with the rhythm. My biggest challenge really is keeping that reader with me, keep the reader interested, try to say things that she or he will find interesting, try to keep that reader reading. That's the biggest challenge. Secondary has to do with my content, and trying to be accurate to the situations I'm describing, trying to represent them with great faithfulness so that someone can come along and make their own interpretations based on something that really seems to me accurate. So those would be the two. The main one, the relationship with the reader is very, very important and a challenge, and one I enjoy.
Well, I have to say, you really kept this reader going. I was listening to it on Audible while exercising, and I had some of my best exercises because I would think, oh, I'm going to listen just a little bit longer before I get off the treadmill, and on I would go. So it really is a book that you just want. It's really very hard to put down, literally. So you're blind and you wrote the book, obviously, as a blind person. And I wonder how that affected how you wrote the ethnography. I mean, how do you do that? How do you do this work blind?
Yes, thank you. Yes, that also affects the writing as well as the content. I use a screen reader, which is a program in the computer that speaks aloud the text as I write it, and then reads it back to me. And I think that as I become increasingly more blind, and especially in this book, that fact that I've written and revised by listening as opposed to by seeing with my eyes, that has made more of a flow perhaps in the prose, and also made me more focused on the emotional line in the content, that the inner stream of consciousness or the flow between the two women in terms of their dialogue and discussion, it has to be emotionally right. It has to be true to what that order of events is. And that emotional line has become more important, I think, in my writing because of my vision. And I think that a second is the content. Though I was unaware of it, I'm thinking I'm writing about the lesbian couple and inside and outside and all. And I would naturally be incorporating things that have to do with I'm not seeing and she's not seeing, and here she's guiding me and there's the dog guiding us. And my blindness got incorporated in the content almost without my awareness. So that was a natural feature that was interesting for me. There were often, that's why on the cover, there's two women and a guide dog, because for all these years, well, not all the 40 years, but for many of these years, the years while I was writing it, there was always a guide dog there. So there's the two of us, and then there's the third party, the dog that's along, and that affected the content too. But incorporating that disability aspect occurred, but it wasn't almost on purpose. It was just unavoidable.
I can really see how that all those mentions in the text would have been just sort of taken for granted for you until you heard it back when you were listening to it. That's really it's very interesting the way that entered into the book.
Mm.
So I want to ask you, changing gears a bit, about how you see the relationship of this book to the Mirror Dance. As I was, reading both and kind of was sort of seeing some parallels between the two, and I want to talk about what you think of as the connection between those two books.
Okay, and I would be interested too in hearing some connections you see. So the Mirror Dance was based on interviews with about 60 women in a lesbian community in the Midwest that I did, and it was written also in an unusual ethnographic style, and that I used the multiple voices of those 60 women to talk about each other as if you were overhearing the gossip of all of them in this small town, to talk about their life, their interactions and partings and gatherings and getting to know each other in couples and all this. So it was a community study from multiple voices of 60 odd women commenting on and talking about each other and their time. It had no omniscient narrator. It just was the voices, paraphrase talking, and I had great fun writing it. It focused also on dilemmas of self in relation to other. Particularly, it focused on the experience of loss of sense of self that individuals may have had in relation to a lesbian community. Also, this same issue as in the new one of likeness and difference and how that works out in lesbian relationships or relationships between and among women. So that had the multiple voice style. In Are You Two Sisters, I've gone just the opposite in a way, in that it has the interior, intimate, subjective voice of an author as the main narrator that guides you through. So the style is very different. There's a similar focus on the challenge of self in relation to other. I think as I was writing Are You Two Sisters, I often thought of the Mirror Dance and the things I had learned there about these relationships. And it helped me to see them also in my couple. Mm-hmm. So let's see what would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't expect going into reading this book for it to remind me as much of Mirror Dance as it did. But it just really did, as I said a bit in my intro, it felt to me like you were holding up a different kind of mirror, right? As you reflect on back how you and Hannah were both a unit, a couple, but how your individuality still was very important and how you were negotiating that boundary. And that came through to me really strongly in Mirror Dance as well. Although with Mirror Dance, I think we see a little more of the way community kind of almost, to be a member of a group almost put some pressure on us to conform. And it felt like, there you were dealing a lot with the tension between yourself as a lesbian and what that meant, not wholly buying into the lesbian community, or, having some problems, I guess, with the lesbian community at the same time. So they felt very similar in a way, but it felt like this was just a much more intimate mirror, and it allowed you to ask even more probing questions, I think, about the being together and being separate, right? Because I think about, when you think about intimate couples, is really mostly being together. So I think it kind of pushed that question about separateness and togetherness a bit closer to home. And I found that really interesting.
Right. Yes, it did. And I think in the Mirror Dance, I've looked back over it recently. I have often the articulation of the problem. I was there concerned about loss of sense of self. Yeah. Individuals might feel in relation to a group. And the people in relation to that group were in the group relatively short term compared to the 40-year life of a
exactly.
And so I think of in Are You Two Sisters, in a way, I had to not just articulate the problem, but solve it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a bigger challenge.
The tone of this book has that when I raise differences or different of these challenges, I kind of have to say, well, make them work out in some way. So the couple's still together. They can't just go apart because they're losing their sense of self to each other. They have to somehow come to some ways that it's still okay to be together.
Yes, definitely.
So I think I maybe made a little progress there.
Oh, I definitely think so. So I want to talk a little bit about in the social sciences, and I probably in other areas of research as well. When we're studying people, we often give them a pseudonym to protect their identity. And of course, Hannah is a pseudonym. But I kind of felt that that Hannah here was a pseudonym a little bit less to, correct me if I'm wrong, but a little less to protect her privacy than to kind of underline a point that you made, which is that you're telling this tale from your vantage point. So this is kind of your interpretation of the real Hannah in some way. So was the pseudonym really to protect her identity, or do you think it was more just to really, to let the reader know that while there is a real Hannah out there, this one is going to be a bit of fiction in your telling of the relationship?
Yes, that's a good way to put it. Yes, definitely the latter, that I very much wanted that to be so. And I also normally do change the names of any other persons who occur in my accounts, because I do see them as fictional creations, within social science. So yes, you can also always say that when you give a pseudonym, you're protecting the guilty. But it allows someone to say that wasn't really me. In the preliminary study where you change the names, because they can say, well, that researcher, she made it all up. So it allows the others, it protects them, and it in part because of this fictional quality. I also, the fictional, it wasn't just a fiction. In creating Are You Two Sisters, I very much was storytelling about, and I'd be aware of how, let's give this chapter a happy ending, or come to some resolution. I wanted the reader to feel good about the couple. I should say a little something here about beginning of the mirror dance, and with this, one of the central things that's looked at in terms that can be difficult in a couple is, in this type of couple, two women or two people who have been socialized as female and have a lot of these ways. They have a lot in common, a lot of similarities. And one of the ways that women often get socialized is other-oriented caring, of the other, nurturing of the other. And why, at least I sought out intimate relations with other women, is because that's what I seek in the other, and that's what the other seeks in me. And then if you have the two and they're other-oriented, they want to take care, you can end up where then the one, either way, back and forth, you feel, well, where am I? I just lost.
Exactly.
I was being you, trying to figure out what you need, how to take care of you, that I lost myself. And then that mirror dance had that, and this one had it. And very interesting things happen, but you only really, it helps to see them and understand them, because you only really can get to a better place about them. For instance, often the difference can be experienced as a negative self conception. You feel like the other who you love is wonderful and you're not the same as them. It can be a negative self-evaluation as a result. And someone told me about that at the time when I was doing the mirror dance study, and sure enough, I'm doing this later one, Are You Two Sisters? And I see that happening, and it helps just to see it and to know that some of the things that occur that can be problematic are because you are two, if it's a couple, but you've been socialized in this way that is very other-oriented.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We're about out of time in this segment. Let's just end with one question. What would you like readers to take away most from the book?
Oh, thank you. I like to think I did a good job. And I presented both, the internal of the couple and the relation with the external world. And let's see, the external, I guess more could be said about that at a later time, but there is also a significant focus in the book on this need for self-protectiveness with the outside. One reason being that I hope I convey is that, like that man, lesbianism is really a personal, private, very inner experience for many. And it's hard in the outside world when others seem to try to step into that experience because it is very personal and internal.
Yeah, and somewhat hidden too as an identity.
Yes,
yeah, definitely. So we're now at the place where I think you would like me to read the third excerpt and then say a bit about that before turning to audience questions. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'll explain this one. So this one does turn a bit to the outside world, I guess.
Yes.
From the next to last chapter of the book, Hannah and I are traveling in the Southwest Desert again, and we have had various encounters with the Border Patrol, who are guarding the border between the United States and Mexico. And meanwhile, the two of us are guarding the border between us and the Border Patrol. And this is a passage that closes a chapter that has many reflections on that.
Okay. So this is from the Border Patrol. Hannah and I had grown to prize the late afternoon light out here at Big Hatchet, I thought. It turned everything gold. It hit the grasses and shrubs, hit our faces, hit my golden dogs, made us feel special to be here, at a remove, not bothered, not in our usual spots, our usual haunts, not in the city, not surrounded by others, by white trucks or cattle ranchers or helicopters. Now we were here only with each other. I put my arm around Hannah's shoulder. She came close, slipping her arm around my waist as we stood looking out. A world was far below and at a distance in the outstretched desert. Close by, I felt the quiet surrounding us, saw the land bathed in gold, and treasured my memories of other times. Some more peaceful than others, perhaps, but really all of them were peaceful. The only rough parts that mattered were those that might disrupt the life between us. And we were here now, out at Big Hatchet, out in the desert where few people went or cared to go, other than the ranchers, the hunters, the border patrol, the occasional hikers and migrants. But this space wasn't theirs, it was ours. Wherever we went, we were in our own space together. The outside world, it was just that, outside. It intruded sometimes, unsettling us, but we didn't let it destroy us, even when it entered in sometimes over our boundaries. Focus on us. I remember Hannah had said that time I bemoaned the presence of the white Border Patrol van in our spot in the clearing near the cattle. Focus on us. We're here. We're together. I thought about how she had so often helped me keep the world out, helped me keep disturbing thoughts at bay, helped me feel more settled and reassured within myself, took me places, even if they were foreign to her, places where I could feel a remove. She was magical to me, somehow unexpected. She was practical, yet happy to go on new adventures with me. I took her hand as the three of us walked down the rocky path on the side of the mountain, then along the back road toward our car. We drove out that day through the small town of Hachita with the store that was only open sometimes and the bar that had closed and not opened again. And we stopped at the Hachita store. I bought a tube of toothpaste and a frozen burrito before we went on our way. Just before we pulled out of the parking lot, a woman clerk came from inside to ask if I wanted water for her dog. She disappeared and returned with a large white mixing bowl full of fresh water from the hose outside. Wouldn't want him thirsty, she said. I like dogs. Thank you, I said, wondering what she saw when she looked at us. Two women, traveling, friends or lovers. One had a dog. Let's head out, I said to Hannah. With my toothpaste, burrito, and some memories of an earlier time, we drove on, heading back west to other borders with other meanings and other places we might call our own. It was a good day, don't you think? I said to Hannah as the setting sun shone on the field beside us, turning them a bright straw-colored tan, lighting the land as if it were a shining sea. A very good day, she said. With you, all of them are good.
Thank you. So a comment, that was more, I offer that as the emotional feel for the closing of our main discussion, and we can move on to the comments or questions.
Thank you. Thank you. So Allison Crossley, the sociologist and executive director at the Claimant Institute, is now going to to read some questions and comments that have been offered.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Shelley, and thank you so much, Susan, for sharing this incredible book. Right at the beginning, you said you were hoping to take the reader along with you, and I think that you did that in just an incredible way. So thank you very much. We have a comment here. A participant said, I love the book. We were not asking, not telling, simply standing here on the ridge between two mountain ranges, as you wrote on page 213. And she wrote, I feel this really captures my experience of a lesbian relationship. And I also feel that chapter 15 brings the whole book together very well. I paused to savor the previous chapters after reading this chapter before moving on to the last one. And she expresses gratitude for this book. Thank you very much for sharing that. One question we have is about your own voice and whether it was challenging to maintain and be true to your own voice while documenting the other throughout this book. And since navigation of identity is so important throughout the book, maybe you could share a little bit about your strategy and thoughts.
Oh, well, that's an interesting, complicated question. My own voice, I don't know how to answer it. I do like to write with it, and I like to see what comes up and see if it can possibly help me in reflecting on the external reality as well. So I would say it's something I enjoy using, but that I work on a great deal to try to make it work out well. So I think that question is hard for me to answer in any complexity, but I really do appreciate it. I'll think about it.
Thank you. And maybe a follow-up to that is that you write during your travels that you sought out places where you could be yourself. And that was so striking. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your time in New Mexico, and is there something about New Mexico, about the landscape specifically, that you feel allows you to be yourself?
Well, thank you. Yes, I think that I had certain associations with the desert from the time that I lived and taught there at the University of New Mexico, and I began bringing character Hannah back with me, both to share some of those feelings I had, but also I think I tend to be a person who likes to remove places that are more remote, away from population and all. And so especially after I became more blind, I would have her keep driving us to these remote areas of the southern desert. I think I tend to, maybe even lesbianism aside, often have problems with feeling merged with others. I need to have a sense of separate self. So I think the desert landscape is very fitting for that and calming. And I think that because Hannah and I had special experiences there, that got merged with the feeling of the landscape. So the landscape and us somehow merged together, I think, in this book.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I definitely want to plan a trip to New Mexico now after reading your beautiful descriptions. It was really stunning how you described the landscape.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was trying to bring the reader along with me, so I'm glad we succeeded a bit.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for one last question, and there's many positive comments about your book and how moving it was and how many attendees resonate with what you wrote, and a lot of appreciation I see in the chat. So thank you, Susan. As a last question, I wanted to pose that this book is so intensely personal, and then at the very end, you include a tremendous list of gender scholarship. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about how gender scholarship informed some of your writing or your process along the way.
Oh, yes, thank you, definitely. Yes, even though the book is written in a very intimate, personal style, without references to other works, I definitely have been influenced and feel very indebted to a big literature in several categories that I detail in the bibliographic notes, and one of which is all that literature on lesbianism, especially the earlier works in the 70s, 80s, 90s, when there was this big discovery of lesbians. So there's a big lesbian studies literature that I refer to first, that I'm indebted to. And then there is the gay queer literature that often has men's experiences and queer identified people's experiences that also has helped me, and I feel indebted to. I think a third category, the trans literature, more recently, that I refer to for all the thoughts about choice and gender changes that may occur so that gender isn't fixed is a big literature to refer to. Another is the literature on ethnographic and autoethnographic and experimental methods that I have been versed in that give me a basis for what I do. And the last, I think, the disability studies literature, especially the experience of women with disabilities. So as I write from a personal perspective, in my mind, I am also engaged with many other writers and scholars who have done research in this area, whose work influences how I think and how I present and understand myself and the couple in this book.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. And would you say that this is sort of a foundation in the sense that it's in the back of your head when you're writing? Do you find yourself going back to these sources, or is it kind of just a backdrop?
It definitely, the concepts and all these movements and what's been valued by these other people, they are in my mind as I write about the individual experience. And sometimes I do read over for particular purposes, particular works that may be helpful to me if I like, especially. Oh, and another category is fiction writers. Mm-hmm. Fiction writers talking about their craft. So all these things I read over to the extent they can help me in my own thinking, because even though I write personally, it's also very deeply intellectual because I'm constantly thinking about how to see, how to interpret, how to represent the reality.
That's wonderful. You do that so beautifully. Thank you. Well, maybe we'll conclude with a couple of really positive comments in the chat. Somebody wrote in about how much she loves your cover from the Coast Pride Center in Half Moon Bay. The coast beckons you, and we love the cover of your book. And you have many other positive comments. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Shelley, and especially thank you, Susan, for sharing this wonderful book.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. It was great to be here.